Guess what? It's wartime, dude! This is the American Revolution background info. There's actually a missing title slide before this that should say taxes, taxes, taxes. Now, British colonial governments were very similar. They had one elected house, one house appointed by the king, and a governor appointed by the king. Now, that structure should sound familiar. Basically, our founding fathers did the things that they've known from the past. They just didn't have a king involved. Now, in 1760, the political upheaval in Great Britain and the wars the British were fighting allowed the elected assemblies to increase their power at the expense of the English governors. The elected assembly said, ha ha ha, you get no more money, unpopular governors. So these elected assemblies in the colonies, they increased their power because England was in turmoil, and they quit paying the royal governors. British officials, of course, want to change that situation. So they start taxing, and you know where that goes. The Parliament thought they could pass taxes because the colonies were British citizens, even though the colonies had no representation in Parliament. So the British Parliament thought they could pass taxes on the colonies because they're British citizens. The Brits had also fought the French Indian War, and they needed some help paying the war debt and for the future protection of the colonies. So the British thought they could tax the colonies because they're paying the war debt from protecting them and for their future protection. Now in 1765, the evil beings in the colonist mind in Parliament passed the Quartering Act. That meant you as an everyday Joe, you had to house and supply the British troops. They could eat your food. And if you want to know more about quartering, boop, boop. Now, before 1764, colonial merchants avoided taxes by smuggling. That all changes with the Sugar Act of 64. It not only does it tax sugar, it sets up a formal system of collecting taxes. And if you want to know more about the Sugar Act, Now, in 1765, Parliament passes the Stamp Act, and this taxes all printed material. This is the first direct tax on the colonies, the one that's everybody's going to have to pay. And it made the colonies angry. You can't tax us without representation, is what they said. If you want to know more about the Stamp Act, there's some words for you to read and a video for you to watch. Now, as the Stamp Act protests grew, people took up John Locke's idea that you're born with certain rights. And protest groups like the Committee of Correspondence and the Sons of Liberty began to emerge to protest the Stamp Act. There's some on Committee of Correspondence. You got to say no thanks on that one. And some on the Sons of Liberty. Now, the colonies, they've got to coordinate these protests. They're all over. The British are doing this to everybody. So the colonies want to get together and they want to coordinate it. So they send reps to the Stamp Act Congress. And guess what they say at the Stamp Act Congress? No more to British goods. Now, the Stamp Act Congress shows that colonists are not going to accept direct taxes. So guess what Parliament does? They pass indirect taxes. Taxes on goods that you have to want to be taxed. And they're called the Townshend Acts. And it taxes things like glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. So the Townshend Acts are the indirect taxes in response to the Stamp Act. And if you want to know more about the Townshend Acts, there you go. Now, the colonists responded saying they're not going to pay these taxes without representation. And they resented the fact that these are used to pay the royal governors and judges that we hate. So the colonists say they're not going to pay these taxes without representation, and they resent that they're used to pay the royal judges and governors that they hate. In 1768, British customs agents seize a ship owned by John Hancock. John Hancock was very popular in the colonies, so this sets off more riots in the colonies. And more taxes also lead to more protests. And if you want to know more about John Hancock, there you go. All right, so on March 5th, 1770, protests were carrying on outside the Boston Custom House. That's where they take the taxes, so of course that's where they're going to go and protest. And colonists, they started really getting on the British. They start throwing insults at them, calling them names, snowballs, and rocks. And so the British, wanting to protect themselves, They send for more troops. Eventually, they fired into the crowd. They killed 5 people in the Boston Massacre. Yes, 5 is not a massacre. It's the papers and Paul Revere that kind of built it up to make it a massacre. And there's some more info on the Boston Massacre, and yet more info on the Boston Massacre. Now, Parliament's going to back down again after the Boston Massacre. They preserved the tax on tea, though. They wanted to show that they're the superiors and that they're in charge, so they kept that tax on tea. Of course, the colonists said, yeah, your tax on tea doesn't mean anything to us, and we're going to really get you here. So on December 16th, 1773, the colonists took the protest into their own hands. And guess what they did with that tea? They tossed it in Boston Harbor, hence the Boston Tea Party. So the Boston Tea Party, they're tossing that tea to protest the taxes. You want more on the Boston Tea Party? You have to hit no thanks, but you'll get some. And yet more on the Boston Tea Party. And that's a pretty good video right there. Now, British leaders, they respond to the Boston Tea Party by saying, until you pay the whole price of that tea, we're going to close Boston Harbor. And guess what? You guys are starting to get kind of violent with us, so we're going to send some troops and some warships. The colonists respond. They said, these are the intolerable acts. We cannot deal with the closing of Boston Harbor. And they respond with more protest and more violence. So all the colonies said, well, we're all in this together. And they send reps to Philly in 1774 for the First Continental Congress. And what do they agree on there? They agree that they're not going to buy and keep any more British stuff. They're going to boycott British goods. And they agree on a system to enforce that. I kill you! This is the actual war. Now, on April 19, 1775, the real stuff erupts in the towns west of Boston called Lexington and Concord. So the war actually starts in Lexington and Concord. And it starts because the governor of Massachusetts sent a whole bunch of British troops over to Lexington and Concord and said, you got to go get these weapons that people like John Hancock are putting away. And if you want more on Lexington and Concord, there you go. And yet some more. My internet's running slow, but it should work with yours. Now, the colonists are tipped off by writers such as Paul Revere. So they call out their militia to meet the British threat. This is where Paul Revere comes in. He tips them off, and he wasn't the only one, though. But here's some on Paul Revere. Sorry, my internet's running slow. Should work for you. Now, at Lexington and Concord, the British ordered the colonists to disperse. And the colonists were actually trying to when a shot rang out. Somebody fired a gun. Somebody messed up. And so now it's on. And the British laid the smackdown to the colonists at Lexington. But they were actually ambushed a lot on their way back to Boston. So in May of 1775, colonies say, well, the war's on. We got to get back together. And they assemble at Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. In the spring of 1776, Great Britain says, well, you guys are at war with us, we're going to pass some stuff on you in Parliament. And they pass the Prohibitory Acts. It blockades all the colonial ports. Going to be a big problem as the war goes on. And this moved many in the Continental Congress to want to get rid of the Brits. They want independence. But guess what? They lack permission from their own states. This began changing in April and June. So on May 15th, 1776, Richard Henry Lee moves for independence. John Adams seconds this vote for independence. But guess what? Congress decides to postpone the vote until they can get state approval. They say, okay, you can do it. And so here's some more on Richard Henry Lee and some more on John Adams. Now in June of 1776, something happens that changes attitudes. Common Sense was published, and it gave a common sense argument that anybody, even the everyday Joes, could understand for independence. Huge moment in American history. And guess what? You can actually read it from the video. So with Common Sense, on June 11th, 1776, the Continental Congress approves a committee to write a declaration. So, with common sense, on June 11th, 1776, Congress finally is going to start moving towards independence. They approve a committee to write the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, through circumstances, becomes the main author of the Declaration of Independence. They actually vote for it they vote to declare independence on July 2nd, 1776, and they accept the Declaration on July 4th. And so to give you some more, you can actually read the text of the Declaration of Independence right here. You can actually, my internet is running slow, read more about Thomas Jefferson. And you can actually watch a video about Thomas Jefferson. Now, at the beginning of the war, the British had the advantage of the better manufacturing. They could make the stuff you need in war, like some guns. And they've got an established government. The colonists, they struggled to pay for the war. Their soldiers suffered, and it leads to inflation in the colonies, which causes all kinds of other issues. Now, the colonists knew, the people in charge knew they had to change the hearts and minds of the everyday regular colonists to win this war. They had to have as much support as possible. There were actually colonists that did not want to be independent from the British. They're called loyalists, and after the war, a lot of them actually leave. Now, the British angered the colonists even further by hiring Hessian mercenaries. So not only is it the British, you have Hessian mercenaries attacking U.S. soldiers in the colonies and fighting this war. The colonists had to endure hardships. They had a British blockade, so they weren't getting a lot of stuff in. Pretty much it was whatever you made at home. And women had to work harder to free their men to actually fight the war. Now, Washington helped mold the persistence of the army. He's saying by saying, we had enough that day and we should fight another day. He was the one who retreated skillfully. He kept the army going. And if you want to know more about Washington, there you go. Now, after Lexington and Concord, the British retreated to Boston. They tried to knock the colonists off the hills outside of Boston, and they end up doing it, but they end up suffering while they're doing it. They actually run up the hill 3 different times to knock the colonists off the hill. The colonists end up having to retreat because they don't have enough ammo. And the colonists go and they regroup at Cambridge. What's located in Cambridge today? That would be the place of Havre. And if you want to know more about the Battle of Bunker Hill, there you go. Now, 6 months after the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British retreat from Boston, partially because Tubby over here, Henry Knox, goes and recovers cannons from New York, and he brings them all the way back. Nobody thought he could do it, but he actually brings cannons back from a fort that he took in New York. And if you want to read about Henry Knox, there you go. Now, after the British retreated out of Boston, they said, where could our ships give us the awesome advantage we need to win this war? Obviously, New York is a good place for that. And so they go to New York, and they move to New York. They easily overrun the colonial positions in New York. Washington saves the army by running to New Jersey. So the British win the Battle of New York easy, and it becomes kind of their home base. This will tell you more about the battle in New York. Now, after New York, British were content to make New York their winter home. Washington had to give the colonists some hope. They've been beaten up. They've been shellacked. They've been smacked. There was nothing they could do, and they had to have some hope that they could actually win the war. So Washington goes and he crosses the Delaware River in the middle of December, in the middle of snow. Most armies at the time didn't do that. December of 1776. He laid a smackdown on a Hessian force at Trenton, New Jersey. And if you want to know more about the Delaware crossing, there you go. So in the spring of 77, the colonists get another big victory. They whack the British troops led by Burgoyne that were coming out of Canada at the Battle of Saratoga. Huge victory because this is actually what convinces the French to join the war. So Saratoga, big victory for the colonists, convinces the French to join it. If you want to know more about Saratoga, there you go. Now after the British conquer Philly, they moved on forts outside of Philly. This allowed Washington to move his troops to a winter home at Valley Forge. At Valley Forge, Washington, who had never been able to train his troops properly, actually gets time to do it. Valley Forge really brings the army together. And if you want to know more about Valley Forge, there you go. Now, in February of 1778, Ben Franklin begins negotiating with the treaty with the French to bring them into the war. And when he gets them into the war, it makes both sides more equal. So Ben Franklin in February 1778 negotiates the treaty with the French to bring people into the war, to bring them into the war and get both sides more equal. By 1779, the Spanish are in the war too. So by 1779, the Spanish are in the war too, but they're only allies to the French. They said, no thanks to the colonists. So with French entrance into the war, the British decide, well, we're not going to go and stay in the north. We're going to go south. And they turn their focus to the south, where they easily take the cities of Savannah and Charleston. The British were depending on loyalists coming to their aid in the south. They wanted the people who still supported the British to come to their aid. It never happens in the south. So the British Army, they start moving north, and they move into Virginia. Lord Cornwallis, who was the general of that group in the South, moves towards the Chesapeake. The whole ideal is that if he can get to the Chesapeake, he can get on ships and he can get out of there. So he actually moves into a trap. He becomes trapped at the town of Yorktown. The French actually show up and cut off the British escape right at the right time. This forces Cornwallis to surrender. So Cornwallis is trapped by Washington coming down from the north, and the French making sure they can't escape at Yorktown. And there's a video that tells you more about Yorktown. It's actually a video from the Patriot. Pretty good. And the siege of Yorktown. Now the Patriots win the war because of four things. First, the British made tactical mistakes. They underestimated the colonists. The colonists kept fighting and Washington kept them going. Second, the British misunderstood the nature of the conflict. They misunderstood that these colonists are fighting for their livelihood and their freedom. Third, the Patriots are highly motivated and they've got good leadership. They have people like Washington. And fourth, of course, they get help from the French. So the Patriots win the war because of four things. The British made tactical mistakes. The British misunderstood the nature of the conflict. The Patriots are highly motivated with good leadership. And the Patriots get help from the French. Now, the loss at Yorktown is what gets the Brits out of the war. People were tired of the high taxes by 1782, and when they lose at Yorktown, that's like, whoa. So the new British leadership starts looking to make peace. In 1783, Ben Franklin negotiates the Treaty of Paris with the British. That ends the war, and it grants the colonists the territory east of the Appalachian Mountains. Here's more on the Treaty of Paris. And this is actually opening up to a whole series of videos about the American Revolution that you can use.